The rain fell like tears from a gray October sky, drumming against the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Cathedral as we gathered to bury the only person who had ever shown me genuine kindness. Uncle Edmund's mahogany casket gleamed under the cathedral's dim lighting, surrounded by flowers that cost more than most people earned in a month, a final display of the Whitmore family's wealth and status that had defined my entire existence as an outsider looking in. I sat in the back pew, wearing the only black dress I owned, a second-hand piece I'd bought from a thrift store for my high school graduation. Around me, the cream of Boston society filled the cathedral's ornate seats, their designer mourning attire and practiced expressions of grief marking them as members of a world I'd never truly belonged to, despite sharing the Whitmore blood that should have guaranteed my place among them. Helena Whitmore Ashford commanded the front row like a general surveying her troops, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the occasion, her Chanel suit armor against any emotion that might threaten her carefully maintained composure. At 62, she was Edmund's younger sister, and the undisputed matriarch of the family since their parents' death 15 years earlier. Her children flanked her, Marcus with his Harvard MBA and inherited arrogance, Vivian with her trust fund and social media following, both of them everything I would never be in the eyes of the Whitmore clan. The service proceeded with the kind of pomp befitting a man who'd built his father's modest investment firm into a financial empire worth hundreds of millions. Ministers praised Edmund's philanthropy, business associates lauded his vision, and family friends shared carefully crafted memories that painted him as the pillar of the community he'd certainly been to everyone except me. But it was after the service, as we filed out into the rain-soaked cemetery, that Helena's true feelings about my presence finally erupted into the open. I was standing at the edge of the crowd gathered around Edmund's graveside, trying to remain invisible while still paying my respects to the man who'd raised me from age 7, when Helena's voice cut through the murmured condolences like a blade. "She won't get anything," Helena announced loudly enough for half the cemetery to hear, her aristocratic Boston accent sharp with disdain. "She shouldn't even be here." Several people turned to follow her gaze, their eyes landing on me with expressions ranging from curiosity to embarrassment to outright agreement. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation as whispers rippled through the gathering like wildfire. Some mourners had the grace to look away, clearly uncomfortable with Helena's public cruelty, but others nodded approvingly, as if my presence at Edmund's funeral was indeed an affront to proper social order. Marcus laughed first, a sound like breaking glass that encouraged others to join in. "Mother's right," he said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced consequences for his words. "The bastard got enough charity from Uncle Edmund while he was alive. Time for her to make her own way in the world." The word bastard hung in the rain-soaked air like a curse. It was the label that had followed me my entire life, the reminder that my mother had been Edmund's housekeeper, who'd somehow convinced him to let her illegitimate daughter live in his mansion after her death. In Helena's version of family history, I was nothing more than the product of some unnamed man's irresponsibility and my mother's moral failing, a burden that Edmund had shouldered out of misguided kindness. I wanted to scream at them, to remind them that Edmund had loved me, that I'd been the one sitting by his bedside during his final months while they'd been too busy with their social obligations to visit. I wanted to tell them about the stories he'd shared during those long nights, about the way his eyes lit up when I brought him books from the library, about how he'd insisted on paying for my education, despite Helena's constant protests about throwing good money after bad. Instead, I remained silent, my heart fracturing into pieces that felt too sharp to ever heal properly. The rain intensified, matching the storm raging inside my chest, as I watched the only family I'd ever known close ranks against me with the efficiency of soldiers repelling an invasion. "She never belonged here anyway," Vivian added, her voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that came naturally to someone who'd never questioned her place in the world. "Mother, didn't Uncle Edmund already set up some kind of trust fund for her education? Surely that's more than generous for someone who's not really family." "The education fund. $50,000 that would cover my remaining college tuition and maybe a year of graduate school if I was careful." It was more money than I'd ever seen at once, but compared to the Whitmore family's vast wealth, it was pocket change, a polite dismissal disguised as generosity. As the burial service concluded and the crowd began to disperse, I caught fragments of conversations that confirmed what Helena had announced so publicly. Edmund's will was straightforward. The vast majority of his estate would go to Helena and her children, with smaller bequests to various charities and loyal employees. The girl he'd raised as his own daughter raided only the educational trust fund, a final reminder that charity has limits and blood will always tell. I stayed by the graveside long after everyone else had left, standing in the rain without an umbrella, watching the groundskeepers prepare to fill in the earth that would cover the man who'd been more father to me than guardian. Edmund Whitmore had taken me in when I had nowhere else to go, had given me a home in his mansion and an education at the finest schools, had treated me with kindness, even when his own family made it clear that I was an unwelcome burden on their privilege. But he hadn't protected me from this moment. He hadn't ensured that I would have a place in the family after his death. He'd He'd left me to face Helena's cruelty and his grandchildren's disdain with nothing but an education fund and memories of a kindness that had died with him. As I finally turned to leave the cemetery, water dripping from my hair and my cheap dress clinging to my shivering frame, I made a promise to the gray October sky and the man sleeping beneath the earth. I would make something of myself despite their dismissal. I would prove that the bastard daughter they'd written off was stronger than their cruelty. 2 years later, that promise would be tested in ways I never could have imagined. My mother's name was Rosa Martinez, and she died on a Tuesday morning in April, when the dogwood trees outside Edmund's mansion were just beginning to bloom. I was 7 years old, small for my age, with the kind of dark hair and olive skin that marked me as different from the fair-haired Whitmores who lived in the portraits lining the mansion's grand staircase. Rosa had worked as Edmund's housekeeper for 3 years before I was born, one of a dozen staff members who kept the sprawling Beacon Hill estate running with invisible efficiency. She was 22 when she arrived from El Salvador with limited English and unlimited determination to build a better life in America, the kind of immigrant story that Boston's elite like to celebrate in theory while ignoring in practice. Edmund found her collapsed in the mansion's kitchen that Tuesday morning, her heart having finally surrendered to the rheumatic fever that had been slowly killing her for months. She'd hidden her illness with the desperation of someone who couldn't afford to lose her job, working through pain and exhaustion while her daughter played in the servants' quarters, unaware that their life together was measured in borrowed time. I remember Edmund kneeling beside my mother's bed in the small room off the kitchen where we lived, his usually commanding presence diminished by grief as he held Rosa's hand and promised to take care of me. She could barely speak by then, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but her eyes were fierce with maternal determination as she extracted that promise from the man who employed her. "Jade is special," she whispered in the heavily accented English she'd never quite mastered. "She's smart, like her father. Promise me you'll help her learn, help her become someone important." Edmund had nodded solemnly, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I promise, Rosa. She'll have every opportunity my own children would have had." It was the closest Rosa ever came to revealing anything about my father's identity. Throughout my childhood, whenever I asked about him, she would only say that he was a good man who couldn't stay, and that someday I would understand why some love stories have to end before they begin. Her death took those secrets with her, leaving me with only fragments of Spanish lullabies and the genetic lottery that had given me her beauty and someone else's intelligence. Helena's reaction to Edmund's decision to raise me as his ward was swift and vicious. She arrived at the mansion within hours of Rosa's funeral, her own children in tow, prepared to remedy what she saw as Edmund's temporary lapse in judgment. "You can't seriously be considering keeping her," Helena said, her voice sharp with incredulity as she stood in Edmund's study, gesturing toward me like I was a piece of problematic furniture. "She's the housekeeper's child, Edmund. Send her to relatives in El Salvador, or find a nice Catholic family who wants to adopt a charity case." I was sitting in the corner with a picture book, pretending to read while actually listening to every word of the conversation that would determine my fate. At 7, I already understood that adults often forgot children were listening, and I'd learned that important information was usually discussed when they thought I couldn't hear. "Rosa had no family," Edmund replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had built his business empire. "And Jade isn't going anywhere. I made a promise to a dying woman, and I intend to keep it. A promise to the help," Helena spat. "Really, Edmund, your guilt over Maria's death doesn't mean you have to adopt every orphan who crosses your path." Maria. The name hit me like cold water, though I didn't understand its significance at the time. Years later, I would learn that Maria Whitmore had been Edmund's daughter, his only child, who died in a riding accident at age 12. Her death had broken something fundamental in Edmund's spirit, leaving him childless and his vast fortune without a natural heir. "This isn't about Maria," Edmund said quietly, but I could hear the pain in his voice. "This is about doing what's right for a child who has no one else." Helena tried different tactics over the following weeks. She brought child psychologists who suggested I would be more comfortable with a family of my own ethnic background. She located distant cousins in California who might be willing to take me if Edmund provided financial incentives. She even researched boarding schools that specialized in difficult placements for children from complicated circumstances. But Edmund was immovable. I would stay in his house, attend the finest schools, and receive every advantage his wealth could provide. The servants' quarters where Rosa and I had lived were closed off, and I was moved to a bedroom on the second floor, smaller than the ones reserved for family guests, but larger and more luxurious than anything I'd ever imagined. The Whitmore family's response was to treat me like a fascinating anthropological specimen who'd somehow found her way into their pristine world. At family gatherings, I was introduced as Edmund's ward, or the girl Edmund is helping, never as his niece or goddaughter, or any term that might suggest genuine familial connection. Marcus, who was 12 when I arrived, treated me with the casual cruelty that came naturally to boys, raised with unlimited privilege and limited supervision. He would corner me in the mansion's long hallways and explain, with scientific precision, exactly why I would never be a real Whitmore anymore, no matter how expensive my clothes or how elite my education. You're a charity case, he would say, with the authority of someone who'd never questioned his own worth. Uncle Edmund feels sorry for you because your mother died cleaning his house, but charity doesn't make you family, and when Uncle Edmund dies, you'll go right back to where you came from. Vivian, 3 years younger than Marcus but equally committed to maintaining social hierarchies, had her own methods of ensuring I understood my place. She would invite me to play dress-up with her collection of designer clothes, then explain, always kindly, always with a smile, why certain outfits were inappropriate for girls like me. When we attended the same private school, she would introduce me to her friends as my uncle's project, making it clear that while I might share her lunch table, I would never share her social status. But Edmund was different. In his study, surrounded by first edition books and financial documents worth millions, he would sit with me for hours, teaching me about literature, mathematics, and the complexities of building wealth through intelligent investment. He spoke to me like I was his intellectual equal rather than a charity case, asking my opinions and actually listening to my answers. Intelligence is the only aristocracy that matters, he told me one evening, as we worked through calculus problems that were far beyond my grade level. Everything else, money, family name, social position, those are just accidents of birth. But what you do with your mind, that's entirely up to you. Those study sessions became the foundation of my identity. While Marcus and Vivian were learning to navigate social hierarchies and trust fund management, I was developing the kind of analytical thinking that would eventually earn me a full scholarship to MIT. While they assumed their inheritance was guaranteed, I was learning to create my own value through knowledge and determination. Helena never stopped trying to convince Edmund that his generosity was misplaced. At every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every opportunity for private conversation, she would plant seeds of doubt about my character, my gratitude, my ultimate intentions regarding his wealth. She's manipulating you, Helena would say when she thought I couldn't hear, acting sweet and studious to secure her future. Mark my words, Edmund, that girl will show her true colors the moment money is involved. But Edmund's faith in me never wavered, even as his health began to decline, and Helena's campaigns became more desperate. Right up until his final months, he treated me like the daughter he'd lost, the heir he'd chosen, rather than inherited, which is why Helena's public cruelty at his funeral cut so deeply. She wasn't just dismissing me, she was rewriting the story of my entire childhood, reducing 9 years of love and learning to nothing more than an extended act of charity that had finally reached its natural conclusion. Standing in that cemetery, listening to laughter at my expense, I realized that Helena had won the war she'd been fighting since I was 7 years old. Edmund was gone, and with him went any protection I'd had from the family that had never wanted me in the first place. The Whitmore Mansion on Beacon Hill was a monument to old Boston money, its federal-style brick facade hiding 42 rooms that showcased 4 generations of careful acquisition and impeccable taste. I learned to navigate its marble hallways and Persian rugs like a ghost, always aware that my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, always careful not to disturb the perfect order that money and good breeding had created. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, wedged between a guest room that was rarely used and a storage closet that held Christmas decorations worth more than most people's cars. The room itself was beautiful, high ceilings, crown molding, windows that overlooked the mansion's formal gardens, but it felt like a museum exhibit rather than a home. The furniture was antique, but not particularly comfortable, chosen for its historical value rather than its suitability for a growing child. Edmund had tried to make me feel welcome, enrolling me at Briarfield Academy where Marcus and Vivian had been students since kindergarten. The school was a bastion of elite education where trust fund children learned Latin and lacrosse, alongside the social graces that would ease their entry into Harvard, Yale, and the family businesses that awaited them after graduation. I excelled academically from my first day, my hunger for knowledge born from Rosa's dying words about education being the key to becoming someone important. While my classmates struggled with algebra, I was reading calculus textbooks borrowed from Edmund's library. While they complained about history assignments, I was devouring biographies of self-made billionaires and social reformers who'd changed the world through intelligence and determination. But academic success couldn't bridge the social chasm that separated me from my peers. At Briarfield, bloodlines mattered more than report cards, and everyone knew I was the scholarship case, the housekeeper's daughter, who'd somehow managed to infiltrate their exclusive world. It's not that we don't like Jade, I overheard one of Vivian's friends explaining during a birthday party at the mansion. She's perfectly nice, but she's not really one of us, you know? Her mother was the help. The casual cruelty of the statement took my breath away. These were children I'd known for years, kids I'd sat beside in classes and shared lunch tables with, reducing my entire identity to my mother's employment status. In their world, Rosa's love and sacrifice meant nothing compared to the circumstances of my birth. Marcus took particular pleasure in reminding me of my precarious position whenever Edmund wasn't around to witness his cruelty. He would corner me in the mansion's library, where I spent most of my free time, and deliver lectures about social Darwinism and the natural order of things. "You're smart, I'll give you that," he said one afternoon when I was 14, his voice carrying the patronizing tone he'd perfected through years of prep school debate teams. "But intelligence without about breeding is just cleverness. You can memorize all the books in Uncle Edmund's library, but you'll never have what really matters, the instinctive understanding of how the world actually works. He wasn't entirely wrong. Despite my academic achievements, I struggled with the unspoken rules that governed elite social interactions. I didn't understand why certain topics were considered gauche at dinner parties, why some charitable causes were fashionable, while others were déclassés, why the right schools and neighborhoods and vacation destinations mattered more than actual accomplishments. Vivian's approach was more subtle, but equally devastating. She would include me in social activities with the kind of condescending kindness that made exclusion feel like generosity. When her friends planned shopping trips to Newbury Street, she would invite me along, and then express sympathetic concern when I couldn't afford the designer clothes they considered essential. When they discussed summer plans for Martha's Vineyard or the Hamptons, she would ask detailed questions about my fascinating summer job at the local library, making my middle-class employment sound like an exotic anthropological study. "I think it's wonderful that you're learning about working for money," she told me once, her voice bright with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for discussing zoo animals. "It's such an important life skill that people like us never get to develop." The worst part was that neither Marcus nor Vivian was consciously cruel. They genuinely believed they were being kind by acknowledging my existence and including me in family activities. In their worldview, the fact that I was allowed to live in their uncle's house and attend their school was evidence of their family's remarkable generosity rather than simple human decency. Helena's visits became exercises in psychological warfare. She would arrive for dinner with carefully chosen observations about my behavior, my appearance, my academic choices that suggested I was somehow failing to appreciate the opportunities Edmund had provided. "I worry that all this academic pressure isn't healthy for a girl her age," she would say, watching me struggle through calculus homework that was 3 years ahead of my grade level. "Perhaps she should focus more on developing social skills and practical life skills. After all, not everyone is meant for intellectual pursuits." When I won the state mathematics competition at age 15, Helena's response was to suggest that my success might be making my classmates uncomfortable, and that perhaps I should consider toning down my achievements to fit in better socially. "Exceptional performance can be isolating," she explained to Edmund with the authority of someone who'd never been exceptional at anything except manipulating social situations. "Young people need to learn balance." Jade's intensity might be setting her up for disappointment later in life, but Edmund defended my academic ambitions with the fierce protectiveness of someone who recognized genuine talent. He hired additional tutors when my public school education proved insufficient, enrolled me in summer programs at MIT and Harvard, and encouraged me to dream beyond the limitations that others tried to impose on my aspirations. "Don't let them make you smaller," he told me during one of our evening study sessions, his voice carrying an urgency that I didn't fully understand at the time. "Your mind is a gift that no one can take away from you, no matter what happens to everything else." As Edmund's health began to decline during my junior year of high school, the family's treatment of me shifted from condescending tolerance to barely concealed hostility. Helena began making more frequent visits, ostensibly to help care for her brother, but actually to position herself as his primary advisor on family matters. Marcus and Vivian, now in college but still dependent on family money, started spending more time at the mansion, their presence a constant reminder that I was the outsider in what would soon become their inheritance. The changes were subtle but unmistakable. Family dinners became strategic planning sessions for post-Edmund arrangements, with conversations carefully steered away from topics that might include me. Helena began referring to family decisions and family property with increasing frequency, making it clear that my presence was temporary and my input was neither wanted nor welcome. When Edmund was hospitalized for the first of what would become frequent stays, I was the only one who visited him daily, sitting by his bedside reading financial newspapers and discussing the market analysis that had always been our shared intellectual passion. But when family members came to visit, I was quietly asked to wait in the hallway while they discussed private family matters. "You're very devoted to Uncle Edmund," Vivian observed one evening after she'd emerged from one of these private conferences. "It's sweet how much you care about him. I hope you understand that his illness is very difficult for those of us who are actually family." The implication was clear. My grief was performance rather than genuine emotion. My devotion was calculated rather than heartfelt, and my presence during Edmund's final months was an intrusion on the family's private suffering. By the time Edmund came home for his final weeks, the battle lines had been drawn. Helena had effectively taken control of the household, making decisions about medical care, visitor schedules, and daily routines with the authority of someone preparing to inherit responsibility along with assets. I was allowed to maintain my academic schedule and continue my evening visits with Edmund, but it was clear that these privileges existed at Helena's sufferance and could be revoked at any moment. "I want you to understand," Helena told me the week before Edmund's death, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow child, "that Edmund's generosity toward you has been extraordinary, but generosity has limits, and family responsibility priorities must come first. When this is all over, you'll need to be prepared to make your own way in the world. I nodded politely, giving her the submissive response she expected while internally calculating exactly how many scholarships I would need to complete my education without any support from the Whitmore family wealth. I'd been preparing for this moment since I was 7 years old, learning to rely on my own abilities rather than the charity that could be withdrawn at any time. What I hadn't prepared for was the public humiliation that would come with Edmund's funeral, the casual cruelty that would transform my grief into entertainment for people who'd spent years treating me like an interesting pet project. Standing in that cemetery, listening to laughter at my expense, I realized that my childhood in the Whitmore mansion had been preparation for this moment, not the moment when I would claim my place in their family, but the moment when I would finally understand that I never had a place to claim. Marcus Whitmore was 21 when I first moved into the mansion, already a sophomore at Harvard Business School with the kind of casual confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world. He stood 6 feet tall with the fair hair and patrician features that marked him as a true Whitmore heir, blessed with the genetic lottery that ensured he would be welcomed in any boardroom or country club in America. More importantly, he possessed the unshakable belief that privilege was something he'd earned rather than inherited, making him dangerous in the way that only the unaware can be. I was fascinated by Marcus during my early years in the mansion, studying him with the intensity of an anthropologist examining an alien species. He moved through life with a graceful arrogance that I envied even as it intimidated me, never questioning whether doors would open for him, never doubting that his opinions mattered or that his future was secure. At family dinners, he would hold forth on economics and politics with the authority of someone whose Harvard professors had confirmed his natural superiority, while I sat quietly at the children's table, absorbing lessons about power that no textbook could teach. The problem with most people, Marcus explained during one memorable Thanksgiving dinner when I was 12, is that they don't understand the difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. Everyone gets the same chance, but some people are simply better equipped to succeed. He was looking directly at me when he said it, his smile polite, but his message clear. In Marcus's worldview, my academic achievements were impressive for someone of my background, but they would never compensate for the fundamental disadvantages of my birth. I was running an interesting race, but I was competing in a different league entirely. Vivian was 3 years younger than Marcus, but equally committed to maintaining the social hierarchies that kept our family comfortable. She was beautiful in the effortless way of girls who'd never questioned their own worth, with honey blonde hair and the kind of bone structure that looked elegant even in candid photographs. By the time she reached high school, Vivian had already mastered the art of being charming while simultaneously devastating, delivering cuts so precise that her targets often didn't realize they'd been wounded until much later. "I just think it's amazing how hard you work," she told me once when we were both 15, her voice bright with admiration that somehow felt like pity. I could never be so focused on grades. "I guess when you have other advantages, you don't need to worry so much about perfect test scores." The other advantages she referred to were obvious to anyone with eyes: beauty, social connections, and most importantly, the unquestioned certainty that her future was secure regardless of her academic performance. Vivian's high school transcript was mediocre, her SAT scores were adequate, and her college applications were enhanced more by her family's donation history than her personal achievements. But she was accepted to prestigious schools anyway, because the Whitmore name opened doors that talent alone could never budge. What made Marcus and Vivian particularly formidable was their genuine affection for Edmund, combined with their absolute certainty that I was exploiting his kindness for personal gain. They weren't consciously cruel. In their minds, they were protecting their beloved uncle from a manipulative charity case who'd somehow wormed her way into his affections. "Uncle Edmund has such a soft heart," Vivian confided to her friends during a birthday party at the mansion, her voice carrying across the garden to where I was sitting alone with a book. "He feels so guilty about what happened to his daughter that he tries to save every sad case that crosses his path. We worry that people take advantage of that." Marcus was more direct in his assessments, cornering me in the mansion's library one afternoon when I was 16 to deliver what he clearly considered a necessary dose of reality. "I know you think you're clever," he said, settling into the leather chair across from my study table with the casual authority of someone who owned everything in sight. "And you are smart, I'll give you that, but intelligence without context is just raw processing power. You can memorize every book in this room, but you'll never understand what it really means to be a Whitmore." "I'm not trying to be a Whitmore," I replied, not looking up from my calculus textbook. "I'm just trying to get an education." Marcus laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. "Everything you have comes from our family's generosity. Your clothes, your school, your books, this house, all of it belongs to us. And when Uncle Edmund dies, all of that generosity ends. You might want to start thinking about what comes next." The threat was delivered with a smile, but its implications were crystal clear. Marcus wanted me to understand that my place in the mansion was temporary, that my access to the Whitmore world would end with Edmund's death, and that I should be preparing myself for a very different kind of future. Both cousins excelled at making me feel like a visitor in the only home I'd ever known. They would plan family activities without including me, then express surprise eyes when I felt excluded. They would discuss family history and traditions in front of me, while somehow managing to make it clear that this heritage belonged to them alone. They would invite their friends to the mansion for parties and gatherings, where I was welcome to attend, but never to truly belong. The most painful part was watching how different they were with Edmund compared to how they treated me. With their uncle, both Marcus and Vivian were genuinely affectionate, displaying the kind of easy intimacy that comes from unconditional love and shared history. Marcus would seek Edmund's advice on business school projects, and Vivian would curl up beside him during family movie nights, both of them basking in the warmth of someone who'd loved them since birth. I envied that easy affection, even as I cherished the different but equally genuine bond I'd built with Edmund through our shared intellectual pursuits. But I was always aware that their relationship with him had a biological foundation that mine could never match, and that this distinction would matter enormously when the time came to divide his legacy. "Uncle Edmund loves you," Vivian told me once with the kind of patronizing kindness that felt worse than outright hostility. "But love and family aren't the same thing. When someone dies, their real family has to take care of the practical matters. It's just how things work." As Edmund's health declined during my senior year of high school, Marcus and Vivian began spending more time at the mansion, ostensibly to help with his care, but actually to establish their presence as his natural heirs and successors. They would arrive for weekend visits with flowers and get-well cards, making themselves useful in ways that demonstrated their devotion, while subtly highlighting my position as an outsider dependent on family charity. Marcus, now graduated from Harvard Business School and working at a prestigious investment firm, would spend hours discussing market trends and investment strategies with Edmund, demonstrating his readiness to carry on the family's financial legacy. Vivian, finishing her senior year at Wellesley, would organize Edmund's medications and coordinate with his medical team, showing her commitment to family caregiving responsibilities. Both of them were building their cases for inheritance not through manipulation or deception, but through the simple demonstration of their natural roles as Edmund's blood relatives and logical successors. They were everything I could never be, legitimate heirs with unquestioned claims to family wealth and social position. When Helena began her campaign to prepare Edmund for post-death arrangements, Marcus and Vivian served as her lieutenants, reinforcing her messages about family responsibility and natural succession with the subtlety of people who'd been trained in elite social manipulation since childhood. "We know Uncle Edmund wants to take care of Jade," Marcus told me directly one evening after a family dinner where estate planning had been discussed with increasing frequency. "He's mentioned setting up an education fund that should cover your college expenses. That's incredibly generous, especially considering..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Considering that I wasn't actually family, considering that Edmund had no legal obligation to provide for me, considering that most people in my position would receive nothing at all. By the time Edmund's final illness began, Marcus and Vivian had successfully established themselves as his primary emotional support system, while relegating me to the role of devoted, but ultimately temporary caregiver. They were the family members who would carry on his legacy, while I was the charity case whose time in their world was drawing to its natural conclusion. Standing in that cemetery 2 years later, listening to their laughter at my expense, I realized that Marcus and Vivian had never seen me as competition for Edmund's affection or inheritance. In their minds, I'd never been a threat, because I'd never been truly family. The idea that I might inherit anything beyond a token educational fund was literally unthinkable to them, not because they were cruel, but because they genuinely couldn't conceive of a world where blood didn't determine worth. That fundamental blindness would prove to be their greatest weakness when the lawyer finally opened that sealed envelope and spoke my name. The first time I noticed Edmund's hands shaking was during one of our evening study sessions in October, 3 months before his death. We were working through quarterly earnings reports from his investment portfolio, a ritual we'd maintained since I was 13, and bright enough to understand the difference between revenue and profit. His fingers, usually steady as a surgeon's when writing notes in the margins of financial documents, trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "Uncle Edmund," I said, looking up from the spreadsheet where I'd been calculating compound growth rates, "are you feeling all right?" He smiled with the kind of gentle deflection that I'd learned to recognize as his way of avoiding conversations he wasn't ready to have. "Just tired, my dear. These old bones aren't as reliable as they used to be." But I'd spent 9 years studying Edmund's habits with the intensity of someone whose security depended on reading subtle changes in mood and health. The tremor in his hands was new, as was the way he occasionally paused mid-sentence during our discussions, searching for words that had always come easily to him. Most concerning was the gradual change in his posture, the slight stoop that suggested his spine was no longer strong enough to support the weight of his responsibilities. The official diagnosis came in November: Parkinson's disease, already advanced enough to explain the symptoms I'd noticed, but not yet severe enough to require major lifestyle changes. Dr. Harrison, Edmund's longtime physician, delivered the news with the kind of professional optimism that meant the prognosis was worse than he was willing to say directly. "With proper medication and physical therapy, you should have several good years ahead of you," Dr. Harrison told Edmund during the appointment I was allowed to attend because I'd become his unofficial medical coordinator. "The progression varies significantly gently from patient to patient. Edmund nodded calmly, asking technical questions about treatment options and long-term care requirements with the same methodical approach he'd always applied to business decisions. But I saw how his hands clenched in his lap during the conversation, and I noticed the way his jaw tightened when Dr. Harrison mentioned the eventual need for additional support with daily activities. Helena's response to the diagnosis was swift and comprehensive. Within a week, she'd researched the finest neurologists in Boston, consulted with specialists at Massachusetts General Hospital, and begun coordinating a care plan that demonstrated both her devotion to Edmund and her natural assumption of authority over family medical decisions. "We need to be realistic about what's coming," she told me during one of her increasingly frequent visits to the mansion. "Edmund will need family around him, people he can rely on completely. This isn't the time for half measures or divided loyalties." The implication was clear. My role as Edmund's study partner and intellectual companion would need to evolve into something more practical, but my position in the household remained contingent on family approval. Helena was offering me the chance to be useful during Edmund's decline, but she was also establishing the terms under which my usefulness would be evaluated. Marcus and Vivian rallied around their uncle with the kind of devoted attention that demonstrated both genuine affection and strategic awareness of their positions as primary heirs. Marcus began visiting every weekend, bringing business reports and market analysis that kept Edmund connected to the financial world he'd dominated for 40 years. Vivian coordinated with the household staff to ensure Edmund's comfort while taking over many of the social obligations that had become too demanding for him to handle personally. Both of them were genuinely loving in their care, but they were also methodically establishing themselves as Edmund's essential support system. They made themselves indispensable in ways that highlighted my position as an outsider, dependent on their continued tolerance. I found my own way to be useful by becoming Edmund's primary companion during the long evenings when his medication made him too tired for business discussions, but too restless for sleep. We would sit in his study, surrounded by the leather-bound books and oil paintings that had witnessed 4 generations of Whitmore family history, talking about literature, philosophy, and the ideas that had shaped his understanding of the world. "Do you ever wonder about the purpose of wealth?" he asked me one December evening as snow began falling outside the study's tall windows. His voice carried a thoughtfulness that suggested the question had been troubling him for some time. "You mean whether money has any meaning beyond security and comfort?" I replied, setting aside the Dostoevsky novel I'd been reading aloud to him. "I mean whether accumulating wealth is actually an accomplishment, or just an elaborate form of record-keeping," Edmund said, his eyes fixed on the fire crackling in the marble fireplace. "I've spent 50 years building this fortune, but what has it actually created? What legacy am I leaving beyond a larger number in a bank account?" The question seemed to demand more than a polite response, so I considered it carefully before answering. "You've created opportunities," I said finally, "for your employees, for the charities you support, for the family members who'll inherit your wealth. Money might just be numbers, but those numbers represent choices and possibilities." Edmund smiled, the expression brightening his face in a way that made him look decades younger. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. You understand that wealth is a tool, not a destination. Most people never grasp that distinction." Our evening conversations became increasingly philosophical as Edmund's physical condition deteriorated. He seemed determined to pass on something more valuable than money, a way of thinking about responsibility, legacy, and the moral obligations that come with privilege. These weren't lessons he was sharing with Marcus and Vivian, whose visits focused on practical matters and emotional support rather than abstract ideas. "Intelligence without wisdom is dangerous," he told me one evening in January, just weeks before his death. "Your cousin Marcus has inherited the family's business acumen, but he's never questioned whether success and worth are the same thing. Vivian has learned to navigate social expectations brilliantly, but she's never considered whether those expectations are actually worth meeting." I felt uncomfortable with the implicit criticism of my cousins, both of whom had been genuinely devoted to Edmund throughout his illness. "They love you," I said carefully. "Their support has meant everything to you." "Of course they love me," Edmund agreed, "and I love them, but love and understanding aren't always the same thing. They see me as the family patriarch, the source of their security and status. You see me as a person with ideas worth considering." The distinction he was drawing seemed important to him in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. Looking back, I realized he was trying to explain why our relationship was different from his bonds with Marcus and Vivian. Not better or worse, but fundamentally distinct in its intellectual foundation. By February, Edmund's condition had progressed to the point where he needed assistance with many basic activities. Helena hired a team of nurses to provide round-the-clock care, but Edmund insisted that I continue our evening conversations even when speech became difficult for him. He would sit in his favorite chair, wrapped in blankets despite the study's warmth, listening to me read from books he'd loved throughout his life. "Promise me something," he said one evening, when his voice was barely above a whisper. The tremor in his hands had worsened, but his eyes were still sharp with the intelligence that had defined his entire identity. "Anything," I replied, though something in his tone made me nervous about what he might ask. "Promise me you'll never let anyone convince you that your worth depends on their approval," he said, each word carefully chosen despite the effort it required. "You have a mind that can change the world. world, but only if you trust it more than you trust other people's opinions of you. I nodded, not understanding why this particular promise seemed so important to him. It would be 2 years before I fully grasped the prophetic nature of his words and the specific circumstances that would test my ability to keep that promise. Edmund died on a Thursday morning in March, peacefully in his sleep, after a night when his pain seemed to have finally subsided. I was the one who found him, having arrived early for our morning routine of reviewing financial newspapers together. He looked serene, almost young, with his face relaxed in a way that suggested he'd found the peace that had eluded him during his final months of physical decline. The funeral arrangements were handled by Helena, with the kind of elaborate attention to detail that demonstrated both her grief and her natural authority over family matters. She chose the cathedral, selected the flowers, coordinated with the ministers, and managed the guest list with the efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this responsibility her entire life. I was included in the planning discussions, but not consulted about major decisions. My role was to provide information about Edmund's preferences and to help coordinate the practical details, but the fundamental choices about how to commemorate his life were made by the family members who would inherit his legacy. Edmund would want this to be a celebration of his life, not just a mourning of his death, Helena said during one of our planning meetings. He was always more interested in looking forward than backward. She was right about Edmund's character, but I couldn't help noticing that the celebration she was planning emphasized his role as a family patriarch and business leader rather than the intellectual curiosity and philosophical depth that had defined our relationship. The Edmund being memorialized in the funeral service was the public figure, rather than the private man who'd spent his final months questioning the meaning of wealth and legacy. Standing at his graveside 2 days later, listening to Helena's cruel dismissal of my place in his life, I realized that the Edmund I'd known and loved was already being erased by the family's need to control his memory. The man who'd valued intelligence over breeding, who'd seen potential in a housekeeper's daughter, who'd spent 9 years teaching me to think for myself, that Edmund was inconvenient to the narrative Helena was constructing about family, legacy, and natural succession. But Edmund had the last word, as I would discover 2 years later when a lawyer's phone call would prove that some promises are kept even from beyond the grave. The eviction notice came exactly 1 month after Edmund's funeral, delivered by a law firm messenger who seemed embarrassed to be serving papers to someone who looked young enough to be in high school. I was sitting in Edmund's study, my study for the past 9 years, working through college applications, when the doorbell rang with the kind of insistent urgency that never brings good news. "Miss Jade Martinez," the messenger asked, consulting his clipboard with the professional neutrality of someone who'd learned not to get emotionally involved in other people's legal troubles. The use of my mother's surname instead of the Whitmore name I'd been using informally for nearly a decade was the first indication that my legal status had fundamentally changed. I signed for the envelope with hands that trembled only slightly, having spent years preparing myself for this moment, even as I'd hoped it would never come. The letter was from Helena's attorney, written in the precise legal language that transforms cruelty into procedure. I had 60 days to vacate the premises and remove my personal belongings. The mansion would be undergoing renovation and reorganization in preparation for its sale, and my continued residence was no longer compatible with the family's estate planning objectives. Helena had chosen her timing carefully. I was 18, legally an adult with no claim to continued support, but still months away from high school graduation and college enrollment. The educational trust fund Edmund had established would cover my tuition and basic living expenses once I started at MIT in the fall, but it provided nothing for the interim period when I would be homeless, unemployed, and completely on my own. I called the number listed on the letterhead and asked to speak with someone about the eviction timeline, hoping to negotiate a delay that would allow me to finish my senior year without the chaos of finding emergency housing. "Miss Martinez," the lawyer's secretary said, with the kind of patient condescension reserved for people who don't understand their powerlessness, "the 60-day notice is quite generous under the circumstances. Most tenants receive only 30 days, but Mrs. Ashford wanted to provide additional time out of respect for your relationship with the deceased tenant." The word hit me like a physical blow, reducing 9 years of family life to a landlord-tenant relationship that could be terminated with proper legal notice. In Helena's version of my story, I had never been Edmund's ward or chosen daughter. I had been a long-term house guest whose welcome had finally expired. Moving out of the mansion was like dismantling my entire identity piece by piece. Everything I thought of as mine had to be evaluated through the lens of what I could actually prove ownership of versus what had been provided through family generosity. My clothes, my books, my computer, all of them had been purchased with Edmund's money, making their ownership status ambiguous at best. Helena solved this dilemma by allowing me to take anything that could reasonably be considered personal personal belongings, while retaining ownership of anything that might have lasting value. I could keep my clothing and school supplies, but the laptop Edmund had bought for my college preparation stayed with the family. I could take the paperback novels I'd bought with my allowance, but the leather-bound classics Edmund had given me for birthdays and holidays remained in the mansion's library. Most painful was the separation from the study where Edmund and I had spent countless hours exploring ideas that had shaped my intellectual development. The desk where I'd learned calculus, the armchair where I'd read Tolstoy and Dickens aloud during his final illness, the bookshelves that had housed my introduction to philosophy and economics, all of it belonged to the Whitmore family estate, not to the charity case who'd been temporarily allowed to use it. "I hope you understand that this isn't personal," Vivian told me as I packed my remaining possessions into boxes borrowed from the mansion staff. "Mother is just trying to be practical about estate management. It wouldn't be fair to Marcus and me if family resources were tied up indefinitely." Her voice carried genuine sympathy, which somehow made the rejection worse than outright hostility would have been. Vivian wasn't being cruel. She was simply accepting the natural order of things, the inevitable correction that restored proper boundaries between family and outsiders. I found temporary housing in a studio apartment above a convenience store in East Cambridge, a 40-minute subway ride from Briarfield Academy, but affordable on the monthly stipend I'd managed to negotiate from the Educational Trust Fund. The apartment was smaller than my former bedroom's walk-in closet, with thin walls that transmitted every conversation from neighboring units, and heating that worked only sporadically during the frigid March weather. But it was mine in a way that the mansion had never been, paid for with money I had legal rights to, rather than family generosity that could be withdrawn at will. I furnished it with items from thrift stores and yard sales, creating a space that reflected my own taste, rather than inherited Whitmore traditions. The daily routine of commuting to school became a meditation on class differences that I'd been insulated from during my years in the mansion. On the subway, I was surrounded by people who worked multiple jobs to pay rent, who worried about medical bills and transportation costs, who understood that security was always temporary and comfort was always earned rather than inherited. My Briarfield classmates' reactions to my changed circumstances ranged from awkward sympathy to barely concealed relief that the social order had been restored. Some made genuine offers of help: guest bedrooms during school breaks, part-time job opportunities, introductions to family friends who might provide mentorship. But most seemed more comfortable with my reduced status, as if my fall from privilege had resolved an uncomfortable anomaly in their social landscape. "I think it's actually good for you," one of my teachers told me during a guidance counseling session about college preparation. "This experience will give you perspective that privileged students often lack. You'll appreciate opportunities more because you've had to work for them." The comment was meant to be encouraging, but it revealed the fundamental assumption that my years in the Whitmore mansion had been unearned privilege rather than a loving family's investment in my potential. In the minds of people who'd never questioned their own advantages, my current struggles were character building rather than simply the predictable consequences of being orphaned twice. I threw myself into my remaining coursework with an intensity that bordered on obsession, determined to graduate as valedictorian and validate Edmund's faith in my intellectual abilities. My final semester grades were perfect. My SAT scores were in the 99th percentile, and my college application essays demonstrated the kind of analytical thinking that impressed admissions committees at elite universities. But the achievement felt hollow without Edmund there to share it. The academic success that had once been our joint project, his teaching combined with my hunger for knowledge, was now just my own desperate attempt to honor his memory while proving that I deserved the opportunities he'd provided. The graduation ceremony at Briarfield was bittersweet. I sat with other scholarship students rather than the Whitmore family section, wearing a dress I'd bought at a discount store rather than the designer outfit Helena would have chosen for family appearances. Marcus and Vivian attended but didn't speak to me, their presence a reminder that we now existed in separate worlds despite our shared educational background. Summer work became a necessity rather than a choice. I found a job at a law firm downtown, filing documents and answering phones for $15 an hour while living on ramen noodles and generic groceries. The work was mind-numbing, but it provided enough money to supplement the trust fund and buy the textbooks I'd need for MIT's rigorous engineering program. My coworkers were kind but puzzled by my presence in their working-class environment. My vocabulary and mannerisms marked me as someone from a more privileged background, but my financial circumstances suggested otherwise. I learned to code switch between the educated speech patterns Edmund had taught me and the more casual communication style that helped me fit in with people who hadn't had access to elite private education. "You talk like money, but you live like broke," one of my coworkers observed during a lunch break conversation about weekend plans. "What's your story?" It was a reasonable question that I couldn't answer honestly without sounding like I was either lying or complaining about losses that most people could never imagine experiencing. "How do you explain that you'd been raised in a mansion but evicted after your guardian's death? How do you describe the experience of losing not just a father figure but an entire social class in the space of a single funeral?" I developed a simplified version of my story that emphasized my academic achievements while minimizing the details about family wealth and rejection. I was a scholarship student who'd been orphaned young and was working to pay for college. All technically true, but incomplete in ways that avoided uncomfortable questions about privilege and loss. As my MIT enrollment date approached, I felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation that had nothing to do with academic preparation. I was intellectually ready for the challenge. Edmund had ensured that my educational foundation was stronger than most incoming freshmen could claim. But I was emotionally exhausted from the process of rebuilding my identity without the security and status that had shaped my adolescence. The night before leaving for college, I sat in my tiny studio apartment surrounded by boxes containing everything I owned in the world. The contrast with my former life was stark enough to be comedic if it hadn't been so painful. 2 years earlier, I'd been a Whitmore heiress with access to unlimited resources and automatic social acceptance. Now, I was a working-class scholarship student with $43 in my checking account and a hunger for success that bordered on desperation. But I was also free in ways I'd never been during my years in the mansion. No one could reduce my achievements to charity or dismiss my opinions as those of an ungrateful dependent. Whatever I accomplished at MIT would be mine alone, built on the foundation Edmund had provided, but sustained by my own determination and ability. I fell asleep that night thinking about promises, the one I'd made to Edmund about trusting my own mind, and the one I'd made to myself about proving that the bastard daughter they'd written off was stronger than their cruelty. Neither promise had been easy to keep, but both had become the foundation of everything I hoped to accomplish. 2 years later, sitting in a lawyer's office listening to my name being read from Edmund's will, I would realize that some promises are kept in ways we never expect, and that justice sometimes comes when we've stopped looking for it. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 2 years and 7 months after Edmund's funeral. I was in my MIT dorm room, cramming for a differential equations exam, while my roommate Sarah practiced violin in the common area, the mathematics and music creating a soundtrack that had become familiar comfort during my sophomore year. Miss Martinez? The voice was unfamiliar, professionally neutral in the way that suggested either very good news or very bad news. This is James Richardson from Richardson, Blackwell & Associates. We represent the estate of Edmund Whitmore. My pencil stopped moving across the page of mathematical proofs, my attention suddenly focused with laser intensity on a conversation I hadn't expected to have. Edmund's estate had been settled within 6 months of his death, the vast majority going to Helena with smaller bequests distributed to various charities and loyal employees. My educational trust fund had been established and was being administered by a different law firm entirely. "I'm sorry," I said, setting down my textbook and moving to the window where I could speak without disturbing my roommate's practice session. "I think there might be some confusion. Mr. Whitmore's estate was settled 2 years ago." "Indeed it was," Mr. Richardson agreed, his tone suggesting that he was aware of information I didn't possess. "However, we've recently discovered a sealed codicil to Mr. Whitmore's will that requires additional probate proceedings. Would you be available to attend a reading this Friday afternoon at our offices downtown?" A sealed codicil. My legal knowledge, acquired through years of listening to Edmund discuss estate planning and business law, was sufficient to understand the implications. A codicil was a supplement to a will, typically used to make minor changes or clarifications to existing bequests. The fact that it had been sealed and recently discovered suggested that Edmund had made last-minute modifications to his estate plan that he'd wanted to keep secret until after the initial settlement. "Are other family members attending this reading?" I asked, though I was already calculating whether I could afford the subway fare downtown and whether Professor Kim would allow me to reschedule my office hours. "Yes, Mrs. Helena Ashford and her children have been notified," Mr. Richardson replied. "The reading is scheduled for 3 o'clock on Friday. Our offices are located at 2 International Place, Suite 4200. I wrote down the information with the mechanical precision of someone processing unexpected information, but my mind was racing through possibilities. What could Edmund have included in a secret codicil? Perhaps additional charitable bequests that he'd wanted to keep private. Maybe specific instructions about the disposal of personal items that hadn't been addressed in the original will. Possibly clarifications about the educational trust fund that would affect how the money could be used. It never occurred to me that the sealed codicil might fundamentally alter the distribution of Edmund's estate. That possibility was so far outside my experience and expectations that it literally didn't register as something to consider. I spent the 3 days between the phone call and the reading in a state of distracted anxiety that made concentrating on coursework nearly impossible. My friends noticed the change in my demeanor, but accepted my explanation that I was dealing with family legal stuff. Without pressing for details I wouldn't have known how to provide. Friday afternoon found me standing outside 2 International Place, in a business suit borrowed from my roommate, feeling underdressed and out of place in the gleaming downtown office building that housed some of Boston's most prestigious law firms. The elevator to the 42nd floor offered a view of the harbor that reminded me of similar vistas from the mansion's upper floors, back when such luxury had been part of my daily environment, rather than an occasional glimpse into worlds I could no longer access. Richardson, Blackwell & Associates occupied an entire floor of the building, their reception area decorated with the kind of understated elegance that suggested both competence and discretion. Original oil paintings, Persian rugs, and furniture that had been built to last generations rather than follow fashion trends, all of it designed to convey the impression that this firm handled matters of genuine importance for clients who expected perfection. Helena, Marcus, and Vivian were already seated in the conference room when I arrived, their designer clothing and confident posture marking them as the kind of people who belonged in such surroundings. Helena's expression when she saw me was carefully neutral, but I caught the flash of irritation that suggested my presence was an unwelcome complication to whatever business they'd expected to conduct. "Jade," Vivian said with a smile that seemed genuinely warm despite the awkward circumstances. "You look wonderful. How is MIT treating you?" The question was polite, but loaded with implications about my reduced circumstances and academic obligations. In the Whitmore family's understanding of appropriate social behavior, my college achievements were admirable, but ultimately irrelevant to the serious business of managing inherited wealth and family legacy. "Very well, thank you," I replied, taking the seat Mr. Richardson indicated at the opposite end of the conference table from the family group. "I'm majoring in mechanical engineering with a focus on renewable energy systems." Marcus nodded approvingly, the gesture suggesting that my career choice met with his approval as appropriately practical for someone in my position. "That's smart. Good field. Lots of opportunities for someone with your background." Someone with your background. The phrase carried layers of meaning about class, opportunity, and the assumptions that guided their understanding of my place in the world. In Marcus's view, engineering was a suitable profession for the intelligent daughter of a housekeeper, respectable, well compensated, but not threatening to established social hierarchies. Mr. Richardson entered the conference room carrying a manila envelope that had clearly been sealed for some time, the wax bearing Edmund's family crest still intact despite years of storage. He was a man in his 60s, with the kind of dignified bearing that suggested decades of handling sensitive family matters for Boston's elite. "Thank you all for coming," he began, settling into his chair at the head of the conference table. "As I mentioned in my phone calls, we've recently discovered a sealed codicil to Mr. Whitmore's will that requires legal attention. The document was found in a safety deposit box that Mr. Whitmore maintained privately, separate from the accounts we administered during the initial estate settlement." Helena leaned forward slightly, her expression sharpening with interest. "What kind of changes did Edmund make?" "The codicil is quite substantial," Mr. Richardson replied, beginning to break the wax seal with the careful precision of someone who understood the gravity of such moments. "It appears that Mr. Whitmore had significant concerns about his original estate plan and wanted to make comprehensive modifications to the distribution of his assets." I felt my stomach clench with nervous anticipation, though I still couldn't imagine what those modifications might mean for my own circumstances. The educational trust fund had already been established and funded. What else could Edmund have wanted to change regarding my situation? Mr. Richardson removed several pages of legal documents from the envelope, scanning them quickly before beginning to read in the formal tone required for such proceedings. "The codicil is dated March 10th, just 5 days before Mr. Whitmore's death, and has been properly witnessed and notarized according to Massachusetts law." March 10th. I remembered that date clearly. It was during Edmund's final week, when his speech had become difficult, and his energy was limited to short bursts of clarity between periods of medication-induced rest. The fact that he'd had the mental acuity and physical strength to execute a legal document during that time suggested that whatever changes he'd made were extremely important to him. "The primary modification," Mr. Richardson continued, "concerns the disposition of Mr. Whitmore's investment portfolio, real estate holdings, and business interests. The codicil revokes all previous bequests of these assets and creates new distributions according to Mr. Whitmore's revised intentions." Helena's face had gone pale, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack as the implications of Richardson's words became clear. "What exactly are you saying?" Edmund's will was very specific about family inheritance. "The original will remains in effect for all bequests not specifically modified by this codicil," Mr. Richardson explained. "However, the bulk of Mr. Whitmore's estate, approximately 92% of his total assets, is now subject to different distribution instructions." He looked down at the documents, then raised his eyes to meet mine directly. "The primary beneficiary of the revised estate plan is Miss Jade Martinez, named as Mr. Whitmore's chosen heir and inheritor of all assets, not otherwise specifically designated." The words hit the room like a physical force, creating a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Helena's mouth had fallen open in shock. Marcus was staring at me with an expression of complete disbelief, and Vivian looked like she was trying to solve a mathematical equation that didn't make sense. I felt the world tilt sideways, reality reshaping itself around information that seemed impossible to process. The bastard daughter they'd dismissed as unworthy of consideration had just inherited one of Boston's largest private fortunes. The charity case they'd evicted from the family home was now wealthier than all of them combined. "This is impossible," Helena whispered, her voice carrying the kind of desperate authority that suggested she was trying to will reality into compliance with her expectations. "Edmund would never. This has to be some kind of mistake." But But Mr. Richardson was shaking his head, his expression grave but certain. The codicil is properly executed and legally valid. Miss Martinez is now the primary beneficiary of Mr. Edmund Whitmore's estate, effective immediately upon completion of probate proceedings. He paused, allowing the magnitude of the announcement to sink in before delivering the final detail that would complete the transformation of everything the Whitmore family thought they understood about their inheritance. The estimated current value of the estate is approximately $347 million. The silence that followed Mr. Richardson's announcement stretched like a taut wire ready to snap, the conference room's elegant furnishings bearing witness to a moment that would fundamentally alter 5 lives forever. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Boston Harbor sparkled in the October sunlight, oblivious to the fact that one of the city's great fortunes had just changed hands in the space of a single sentence. I stared at the lawyer with the same expression someone might wear while processing news of an alien landing, or a spontaneous reversal of gravity. $347 million. The number was too large to feel real, too transformative to process as anything other than an elaborate mistake that would surely be corrected once Mr. Richardson realized he'd read from the wrong document. Helena recovered her voice first, though it came out as a strangled whisper that bore little resemblance to her usual commanding tone. This is impossible. Edmund was dying. He was medicated. He wasn't thinking clearly during his final weeks. No court would uphold a document signed under those circumstances. Mrs. Ashford, Mr. Richardson said gently, the codicil was executed during a period when Mr. Whitmore's attending physician had documented his complete mental competency. Dr. Harrison provided a detailed assessment confirming that your brother was lucid, oriented, and fully capable of making legal decisions. Furthermore, the document was witnessed by 2 independent parties who can attest to his mental state at the time of signing. Marcus had gone completely white, his Harvard-trained composure cracking like ice under pressure. There has to be some kind of legal challenge we can mount. Undue influence, maybe, or fraud. She manipulated him somehow, convinced a dying old man to change his will when he wasn't thinking straight. His accusation hung in the air like smoke, transforming the room's atmosphere from shock to something approaching hostility. I could see in his eyes the desperate calculation of someone whose entire future had just evaporated, whose assumptions about inherited wealth and family legacy had been revealed as castles built on sand. Mr. Blackwell, Richardson continued, consulting the legal documents with the methodical precision of someone who'd anticipated exactly this kind of challenge. Your uncle included a rather detailed explanation for his decision, which I'm legally obligated to read as part of the codicil's execution. He cleared his throat and began reading in Edmund's own words, written in the careful legal language that reflected both his business acumen and his determination to leave no room for misinterpretation. I have spent considerable time during my final illness reflecting on the nature of family, legacy, and the responsibilities that come with inherited wealth. My original will was written according to conventional expectations about blood relationships and traditional inheritance patterns. However, my experiences during the past 9 years have convinced me that these conventions do not adequately reflect my true wishes regarding the disposition of my life's work. Helena made a choking sound that might have been protest or grief, but Richardson continued reading without pause. Jade Martinez has demonstrated qualities of character, intelligence, and moral judgment that convince me she will be a responsible steward of the Whitmore family fortune. More importantly, she has shown me what it means to value knowledge over status, substance over appearance, and genuine relationship over social convenience. In choosing her as my primary heir, I am not rejecting my blood relatives, but rather affirming my belief that family is defined by love and mutual respect, rather than genetic accident. The words hit me like physical blows, each sentence revealing depths of Edmund's thinking that I'd never fully understood during our evening conversations. He hadn't just seen potential in me, he'd been evaluating my character against some internal standard that I'd apparently met while his actual family had somehow failed. This is insane, Vivian said, her voice rising with the kind of desperate energy that comes from watching your entire worldview collapse in real time. Uncle Edmund loved us. We spent years taking care of him, visiting him, being there for him during his illness. She was just the housekeeper's daughter who happened to be smart enough to manipulate an old man's loneliness. Mr. Richardson looked up from the documents with an expression that suggested he'd heard similar challenges many times during his career handling family estate disputes. The codicil addresses that concern directly. Mr. Whitmore wrote, I am aware that my decision will be questioned and possibly challenged by those who believe they have superior claims to my estate. I want to make clear that this choice is not the result of manipulation, undue influence, or diminished mental capacity. It is the carefully considered decision of someone who has had the privilege of observing both genetic family and chosen family over an extended period, and who has concluded that character matters more than bloodline in determining worthiness to carry forward a family's legacy. The lawyer paused, allowing the weight of Edmund's words to settle before continuing with information that would prove even more devastating to the family's assumptions about their inheritance. The codicil also includes specific provisions for the original beneficiary beneficiaries. Mrs. Ashford will receive the Beacon Hill mansion and its contents, along with a trust fund of $5 million. Marcus and Vivian Ashford will each receive $2 million, to be distributed according to the terms outlined in the original will. I watched the family members process this information with expressions that cycled through shock, relief, and renewed anger as they realized that Edmund hadn't completely disinherited them, but had reduced their inheritance to what amounted to rounding errors in the context of his total wealth. $9 million total, Marcus said, his voice hollow with disbelief. Out of a $300 million estate, he left us less than 3% of his fortune. The provisions ensure that your family will be financially secure and able to maintain an appropriate standard of living, Richardson explained, with the diplomatic neutrality of someone who'd learned not to take sides in family disputes. However, Mr. Whitmore clearly intended for the vast majority of his wealth to go to Miss Martinez. Helena stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the conference room's hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. This is not over. We'll challenge this in court, prove that Edmund wasn't competent, demonstrate that this girl somehow coerced him into changing his will. No judge will allow this travesty to stand. You certainly have the right to contest the will, Mr. Richardson acknowledged. However, I should inform you that Mr. Whitmore anticipated legal challenges and took extensive precautions to ensure his wishes would be respected. In addition to Dr. Harrison's competency assessment, he arranged for video documentation of the codicil's signing, consulted with 3 independent attorneys regarding the document's legal validity, and provided sworn testimony about his reasoning for the inheritance changes. The revelation that Edmund had prepared for exactly this kind of legal battle demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that made challenging his decision seem futile. He'd spent his final weeks not just changing his will, but building a fortress of legal protections around his choices. There's one more provision that I need to share, Richardson continued, returning his attention to the documents that had transformed my life in the space of 15 minutes. Mr. Whitmore established a foundation to be funded with $50 million from the estate, with Miss Martinez serving as its director. The foundation's mission is to provide educational opportunities for children from disadvantaged backgrounds, with particular emphasis on supporting students who demonstrate exceptional academic potential, despite challenging circumstances. The foundation. Even in death, Edmund was teaching me lessons about responsibility and the moral obligations that come with extraordinary wealth. He hadn't just given me money, he'd given me a purpose that would honor both his memory and my mother's dreams about education being the key to becoming someone important. The foundation provision cannot be modified or challenged, Richardson added, his tone suggesting that Edmund had been particularly careful about protecting this aspect of his legacy. Mr. Whitmore's instructions are explicit that Miss Martinez will have complete authority over the Foundation's operations and distribution decisions. Helena sank back into her chair, the fight seeming to drain out of her as she realized the full scope of Edmund's planning and the futility of challenging decisions he'd protected with such thoroughness. Her face had aged a decade in the past 20 minutes, the carefully maintained composure that had defined her social identity crumbling under the weight of this unimaginable reversal. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Edmund loved his family. We were everything to him after Maria died. How could he do this to us? For the first time since the reading began, I found my voice, though it emerged hoarse with emotion and shock. He did love you. This isn't about not loving you. It's about something else entirely. Helena's eyes met mine across the conference table, and for a moment I saw past her anger and desperation to the genuine confusion and pain beneath. She truly didn't understand how Edmund could have chosen me over his blood relatives, couldn't comprehend a worldview that valued character over genetics or merit over inheritance rights. What could you possibly have given him that we couldn't? She asked, the question emerging as a plea rather than an accusation. We're his family. We shared his history, his memories, his blood. What did you have that was worth more than that? I thought about the evening conversations in Edmund's study, the hours we'd spent exploring ideas that had nothing to do with money or status or family obligation. I remembered his fascination with philosophical questions about wealth and legacy, his hunger for intellectual discourse that went beyond the practical concerns of managing inherited fortune. I think, I said carefully, he wanted someone who saw him as more than just the source of financial security, someone who valued his ideas as much as his money, who was interested in who he was, rather than what he could provide. The explanation seemed to wound Helena more deeply than any accusation of greed or manipulation could have. It suggested that Edmund's decision hadn't been based on my superior worthiness, but on their family's fundamental failure to understand him as a person rather than a patriarch. Marcus stood abruptly, his movement sharp with barely controlled anger. This is ridiculous. We're talking about one one of Boston's largest private fortunes being handed over to someone who's not even family, based on some sentimental notion about intellectual compatibility. Uncle Edmund was a businessman. He understood the importance of keeping wealth within established family structures. Actually, Mr. Richardson interjected, Mr. Whitmore addressed that concern specifically in his written explanation. He noted that traditional family inheritance often results in the dissipation of accumulated wealth within 3 generations, particularly when heirs haven't been prepared to manage significant financial responsibility. He believed that Miss Martinez's education, character, and understanding of value would make her a more effective steward of his life's work than inheritors who simply expected wealth as a birthright. The lawyer's words carried the sting of institutional criticism that went beyond personal preferences to fundamental questions about merit and preparation. Edmund hadn't just chosen me over his family, he'd judged them incapable of responsibly managing the fortune they'd assumed was their natural inheritance. There is one final provision, Richardson said, consulting the last page of the codicil with an expression that suggested he'd saved the most significant information for the end. Mr. Whitmore included what he called a character test that will determine the final distribution of the estate. I felt my stomach drop as Richardson's words registered. A character test. Edmund had built one final evaluation into his inheritance plan, some kind of moral examination that would determine whether I truly deserved the wealth he'd chosen to leave me. Miss Martinez will have complete access to the estate's assets for a period of 1 year, Richardson continued, during which time she must demonstrate her worthiness to inherit according to Mr. Whitmore's specific criteria. If she passes this evaluation, the inheritance becomes permanent and irrevocable. If she fails, the estate will be distributed according to the original will, with the family members receiving their traditional inheritances. Helena sat up straighter, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since the reading had begun. What kind of test? What criteria? Richardson smiled slightly, the expression suggesting that Edmund's final requirement was as surprising as everything else about the codicil. Mr. Whitmore wrote, Jade must demonstrate that she understands the difference between having wealth and being worthy of wealth. She must prove that she can use this inheritance to create value rather than simply consume it, and that she can remain the person I chose to trust with my legacy rather than becoming corrupted by the power that significant wealth provides. That's completely subjective, Marcus protested. How can anyone evaluate whether someone is worthy of wealth? It's not a measurable standard. Mr. Whitmore appointed 3 evaluators who will assess Miss Martinez's performance during the probationary year, Richardson replied. Dr. Harrison, who will evaluate her personal character and ethical behavior. Professor Janet Morrison from Harvard Business School, who will assess her financial management and strategic decision-making. And Mrs. Catherine Chen, director of the Boston Children's Foundation, who will evaluate her commitment to using wealth for beneficial social impact. 3 evaluators who would spend a year watching me, judging my choices, determining whether Edmund's faith in my character had been justified or misplaced. The prospect was both terrifying and oddly comforting. At least there were objective standards and qualified judges, rather than the subjective family dynamics that had shaped my entire childhood. The evaluation period begins immediately, Richardson concluded, gathering the legal documents that had upended everyone's expectations about the future. Miss Martinez will have access to the full estate during this year, with the understanding that her inheritance depends on demonstrating the character traits Mr. Whitmore believed she possessed. As the meeting concluded, and we filed out of the conference room, I caught Vivian's arm gently, wanting to say something that might bridge the chasm that had just opened between us. Vivian, I want you to know. Don't, she said, her voice sharp with pain that went deeper than financial disappointment. Just don't. You got what you wanted. Uncle Edmund chose you over his own family. I hope you're happy. The accusation stung because it implied that I'd somehow campaigned for this inheritance, that I'd manipulated Edmund's affections to secure financial advantage. The truth was more complicated. I'd loved Edmund genuinely, without any expectation that my affection would be rewarded with wealth, but trying to explain that to people whose entire worldview had just collapsed seemed both pointless and cruel. Walking out of the law firm into the crisp October afternoon, I realized that inheriting Edmund's fortune was only the beginning of a more complex challenge. I had 1 year to prove that the bastard daughter they'd dismissed as unworthy could handle one of Boston's greatest inheritances with wisdom, grace, and integrity. The character test had begun, and everything I'd learned about myself over the past 2 years would be evaluated by people whose judgment would determine not just my financial future, but my worthiness to carry forward Edmund's legacy. Standing on the sidewalk outside 2 International Place, surrounded by the symbols of wealth and power that would soon be mine to manage, I whispered a promise to the memory of the man who'd believed in me when no one else would. I would prove him right, no matter what it cost. The package arrived at my dorm room 3 days after the will reading, delivered by the same messenger service that had brought my eviction notice 2 years earlier. This time, however, the envelope was thick with documents and bore the seal of Richardson, Blackwell, and Associates, rather than Helena's attorney. Inside was a key to a safety deposit box, along with a note in Mr. Richardson's careful handwriting. Mr. Whitmore requested that you receive this after the codicil reading. handwriting. Box 247, First National Bank of Boston. I took the subway downtown that afternoon, my hands trembling slightly as I signed the forms that would give me access to whatever Edmund had wanted me to discover. The safety deposit box was larger than I'd expected, containing several manila folders, a leather-bound journal, and a wooden box that looked like it might hold jewelry or important papers. The bank employee led me to a private viewing room where I could examine the contents without observation. I opened the leather journal first, recognizing Edmund's handwriting on the first page. For Jade, the truth about your family, and why I made the choices I did. My heart began racing as I realized that Edmund had left me more than money. He'd left me answers to questions I'd been afraid to ask throughout my entire childhood. Questions about my father's identity, about my mother's relationship with the Whitmore family, about the circumstances that had brought us to live in the mansion in the first place. The journal was dated over a 10-year period, beginning when I was 9 years old and continuing until just weeks before Edmund's death. It was part memoir, part confession, and part love letter to a daughter he'd chosen rather than inherited. As I read, the carefully constructed narrative that had shaped my understanding of my own life began to crumble and reassemble into something far more complex and emotionally devastating. Rosa Martinez was not simply my housekeeper, Edmund had written in his careful script. She was the woman I loved more than I thought it was possible to love another human being, and Jade is my biological daughter, conceived during a relationship that couldn't be acknowledged publicly without destroying both our lives and hers. The words hit me like cold water, forcing me to stop reading and process information that recontextualized my entire existence. Edmund wasn't my guardian or benefactor. He was my father, my actual father. The man who'd raised me wasn't performing an act of charity, but fulfilling the most fundamental parental obligation, while being forced to disguise his true relationship with his own child. I continued reading with hands that shook so violently I could barely turn the pages. Rosa came to work for me in 1987, when she was 22 and I was 38. She was brilliant, beautiful, and possessed a strength of character that humbled me daily. We fell in love, despite the obvious complications of our different social positions, different cultures, and the scandal that any public relationship would have created for both of us. When Rosa became pregnant, we both understood that acknowledging my paternity would destroy her reputation and limit Jade's opportunities in ways that would be permanent and irreversible. A wealthy white businessman having an affair with his Salvadoran housekeeper was the kind of scandal that Boston society would never forget or forgive. Our daughter would have been labeled illegitimate forever, marked by circumstances that would have followed her throughout her life. We made the painful decision that Rosa would raise Jade as a single mother while living in my household, where I could provide for both of them without publicly acknowledging our relationship. It was an arrangement that protected Jade's future while allowing me to be part of her daily life, even if I couldn't claim her as my daughter. The revelation explained so much about my childhood that had never made complete sense. Edmund's intense interest in my education, his willingness to defend me against Helena's hostility, his evening conversations that felt more like father-daughter bonding than guardian-ward tutoring. He hadn't been unusually generous to a charity case. He'd been loving his own child while being forced to pretend she was someone else's responsibility. Rosa's death was the most devastating loss of my life, Edmund continued. Losing the woman I loved and being forced to grieve privately while maintaining the fiction that she was simply a valued employee nearly broke me. But Rosa's dying words were about Jade's future. She made me promise to help our daughter become someone important, and I vowed to honor that request, regardless of the personal cost. Helena's immediate campaign to remove Jade from the household after Rosa's death was motivated partly by social prejudice, but primarily by her instinctive understanding that my attachment to this child was deeper than appropriate guardian-ward affection. She couldn't prove that Jade was my daughter, but she suspected the truth and wanted to eliminate any potential claim on the family inheritance. I kept the secret to protect Jade from the social stigma that would have followed public acknowledgement of her illegitimate status, but I also kept it to protect myself from Helena's reaction if she learned that the housekeeper's daughter she'd spent years trying to remove was actually her brother's biological heir, and the granddaughter she'd been systematically excluding from family life. The journal continued with details about Edmund's growing conflict between his love for me and his inability to publicly claim me as his daughter. He wrote about watching Helena's children receive the kind of open family affection that he couldn't show me without raising questions about our relationship. He described the pain of seeing me struggle for acceptance within a family structure that couldn't acknowledge my true place. The decision to change my will wasn't motivated by disappointment in Marcus and Vivian, though their sense of entitlement and lack of intellectual curiosity concerned me, Edmund wrote near the end of the journal. It was motivated by the realization that I'd spent 9 years denying my own daughter her rightful inheritance, while allowing my nephew and niece to assume they would inherit wealth that legally and morally belonged to Jade. I couldn't acknowledge her publicly during my lifetime without creating scandal that would have damaged her opportunities and social standing, but I could ensure that my death corrected the injustice I'd been forced to perpetuate while I lived. The final entry was dated just days before Edmund's death. I pray that Jade will forgive me for the years of secrecy sympathy, for allowing her to believe she was a charity case rather than my beloved daughter. I pray that she'll understand why I couldn't claim her publicly, and why I had to wait until death to give her what she always deserved. Most of all, I pray that she'll use her inheritance not just to build her own life, but to help other children who've been marginalized by circumstances beyond their control. Jade has the intelligence, character, and moral foundation to be worthy of the Whitmore name in ways that no one else in our family has demonstrated. She is my daughter, my heir, and my hope for what our family legacy could become. I closed the journal and sat in the bank's private viewing room, crying for the father I'd loved without knowing he was my father, for the mother who'd sacrificed a public relationship to protect my future, and for the years of feeling like an outsider in my own family home. The wooden box contained my parents' love letters, written in Spanish and English over the course of their relationship, along with legal documents that would have proved my paternity if Edmund had ever chosen to acknowledge it. There were photographs of Rosa and Edmund together, their faces showing the kind of happiness that made their secret love both more understandable and more tragic. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope marked for the inheritance evaluators, containing Edmund's request that his biological relationship with me be revealed to Dr. Harrison, Professor Morrison, and Mrs. Chen as part of their assessment process. He wanted them to understand that his decision to make me his primary heir wasn't based on sentiment or manipulation, but on the simple biological fact that I was his only child. The final folder contained financial documents showing that Edmund had been secretly supporting my mother's family in El Salvador since before my birth, sending money to pay for her siblings' education and medical care. He'd been acting as a father and provider in every way, except public acknowledgement, honoring responsibilities that went far beyond legal obligation. Walking out of the bank that evening, I felt the weight of truth settling around me like a heavy coat. I wasn't the bastard daughter of an unknown man who'd abandoned my mother. I was the legitimate heir to one of Boston's great fortunes, hidden in plain sight for years to protect me from social stigma that no longer seemed relevant compared to the family connection I'd been denied. The character test Edmund had designed wasn't just about proving my worthiness to inherit wealth. It was about proving that his daughter could handle the truth about her parentage and use both her inheritance and her knowledge responsibly. Helena, Marcus, and Vivian had spent years treating me like an interloper in my own family home, never realizing that they were the ones without legitimate claims to Edmund's primary affection and inheritance. The bastard child they dismissed had been the legitimate heir all along, and their cruelty had been directed at the very person who had the strongest right to everything they'd assumed belonged to them. That night, I called Mr. Richardson and requested a meeting with the 3 inheritance evaluators. It was time to share the truth about my parentage and begin the real work of proving that Edmund Whitmore's daughter was worthy of her father's legacy. The meeting with my inheritance evaluators took place in Dr. Harrison's office at Massachusetts General Hospital 3 weeks after I'd discovered the truth about my parentage. I sat across from the 3 people who would determine my future: Dr. Harrison with his kind eyes and gentle manner, Professor Morrison with her sharp intelligence and business school precision, and Mrs. Chen with her decades of experience managing charitable foundations, and shared the secret that had shaped my entire life without my knowledge. "I always wondered about Edmund's devotion to you," Dr. Harrison said softly after I'd finished reading selected passages from my father's journal. "It went beyond normal guardian-ward affection, but I couldn't quite identify what made it different. Now I understand. He was loving his daughter while being forced to pretend she was someone else's child." Professor Morrison leaned forward, her analytical mind already processing the implications of this revelation for the inheritance evaluation. "This changes the entire context of Edmund's will modification. He wasn't choosing an outsider over family members. He was correcting a situation where his biological heir had been systematically excluded from her rightful inheritance." Mrs. Chen nodded thoughtfully, her expression reflecting the compassion that had made her one of Boston's most respected advocates for disadvantaged children. "The question now becomes whether you can handle both the emotional weight of this truth and the practical responsibility of managing such significant wealth wisely." We discussed the year-long evaluation process and what they would be measuring during my probationary period. Dr. Harrison would monitor my personal relationships and ethical decision-making, watching for signs that wealth might corrupt my character or damage my connections with others. Professor Morrison would assess my business acumen and strategic thinking, ensuring that I could manage the family fortune responsibly rather than simply spending it. Mrs. Chen would evaluate my commitment to philanthropy and social responsibility, testing whether I understood the obligations that came with inherited privilege. "Your father's journal suggests that you've already demonstrated many of these qualities," Dr. Harrison observed, "but having access to hundreds of millions of dollars creates pressures and temptations that are difficult to predict. We need to see how you handle that reality." The first test came sooner than any of us expected. 2 days after meeting with the evaluators, Helena called and requested a private meeting. Her voice over the phone was subdued, lacking the commanding authority that had characterized all our previous interactions. She suggested lunch at the Four Seasons, neutral territory where we could speak without the emotional baggage of family history. I found her waiting in the hotel's elegant dining room, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. The revelation about my parentage had clearly shaken her profoundly, forcing her to confront years of treating her brother's daughter with callous dismissal. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble as soon as I'd taken my seat. "Actually, I owe you many apologies. But I don't know how to begin making amends for 20 years of cruelty toward my own niece." Her acknowledgement of our blood relationship was the first time anyone in the Whitmore family had publicly accepted me as a legitimate family member. The words carried emotional weight that went far beyond legal recognition or financial inheritance. "I knew," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I always suspected that Edmund was your father, but I convinced myself it couldn't be true, because acknowledging it would have meant accepting that I'd spent years abusing my brother's child out of prejudice and jealousy." She explained how Edmund's intense devotion to my education had triggered her suspicions, how his fierce protection of me during family conflicts had seemed excessive for a simple guardian-ward relationship, but admitting the truth would have required confronting her own behavior, so she'd chosen willful blindness instead. "I told myself you were manipulating him, taking advantage of his loneliness and guilt about Maria's death," Helena said, tears beginning to flow down her carefully made-up cheeks. "It was easier to blame you for being conniving than to admit that Edmund loved you because you were his daughter, and I'd been treating you abominably." The conversation was painful for both of us, but it was also healing in ways I hadn't expected. Helena's apology couldn't undo years of rejection and cruelty, but it acknowledged the harm she'd caused and accepted responsibility for choices that had shaped my entire childhood. "What happens now?" she asked as our lunch concluded. "I know you have every right to hate us, to exclude us from your life the way we excluded you from ours. We treated you terribly, and now you have the power to return that treatment." It was a fair question that went to the heart of what my inheritance evaluators were measuring. Did I understand the difference between justice and revenge? Could I use my newfound power responsibly rather than vindictively? Was I capable of the grace that Edmund had always demonstrated, even when dealing with people who'd wronged me? "I want to try something different," I said carefully. "I want to see if we can actually become a family now that the truth is out. Real family, not the performance we've been pretending to maintain for years." Over the following months, I used my inheritance to begin rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by decades of secrecy and prejudice. I paid off Marcus's student loans and helped him start the investment firm he'd been dreaming about, giving him the chance to prove his business acumen without the pressure of inherited wealth he'd never actually been guaranteed. I funded Vivian's graduate program in social work, supporting her desire to work with disadvantaged children while helping her understand the perspective of families who lacked the security she'd always taken for granted. Most importantly, I established the Edmund Whitmore Foundation with Mrs. Chen's guidance, creating an organization that would provide educational opportunities for children from marginalized backgrounds. The foundation's first initiative was a scholarship program for students whose academic potential exceeded their families' financial resources, children like I had been, whose futures depended on the kindness of people who saw beyond circumstances of birth. Helena became one of my closest advisors in this work, using her social connections and organizational skills to support the foundation's mission. Working together to help other families allowed us to heal some of the wounds that had divided us for so many years. "I understand now why Edmund chose you," she told me during one of our foundation planning meetings. "It wasn't just because you're his daughter. It was because you have the character to use wealth for purposes beyond personal gratification. You're everything he hoped the Whitmore legacy could become." The inheritance evaluation concluded exactly 1 year after the will reading, with all 3 evaluators recommending that I be confirmed as Edmund's permanent heir. Dr. Harrison noted that I demonstrated emotional maturity and ethical decision-making throughout the probationary period. Professor Morrison praised my strategic thinking and responsible approach to wealth management. Mrs. Chen highlighted my commitment to philanthropy and my understanding of social responsibility. "Edmund chose well," Dr. Harrison said during the final evaluation meeting. "You've proven that you can handle both the emotional truth about your parentage and the practical challenges of managing significant wealth. More importantly, you've shown that you understand wealth as a tool for creating positive change rather than simply a source of personal privilege." Standing in Edmund's study on the anniversary of his death, surrounded by the books and memories that had shaped my intellectual development, I finally understood the complete arc of his love and sacrifice. He'd spent my entire childhood being my father while pretending to be my guardian, protecting me from social stigma while ensuring that I developed the character and intelligence that would make me worthy of his legacy. legacy. The bastard daughter that Helena had dismissed at his funeral had been his legitimate heir all along, hidden in plain sight by a society that couldn't accept love that crossed class and cultural boundaries. But Edmund's patience and planning had ultimately triumphed over prejudice and convention, ensuring that his daughter would inherit not just his wealth, but his commitment to using privilege responsibly. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer, ready to begin the next phase of my father's legacy. There were scholarships to establish, foundations to manage, and families to help. Work that would honor both Edmund's memory and Rosa's dreams about education being the key to becoming someone important. The girl who'd been told she wouldn't get anything had inherited everything that mattered: wealth, family, purpose, and the knowledge that love ultimately proves stronger than the forces that try to divide us. Edmund had kept his promise to my mother, ensuring that their daughter would become exactly the kind of important person Rosa had envisioned during those final moments of her life. Justice had taken 20 years to arrive, but it had come completely and permanently, transforming the abandoned child into the rightful heiress, and proving that some battles are won not through confrontation, but through patience, character, and the quiet determination to become worthy of the love that shapes us. In the end, that was Edmund's greatest gift, not the money, but the faith that had sustained me through years of rejection, and the knowledge that I had always been exactly where I belonged, at the center of a love story, too complex for society to understand, but too powerful for prejudice to destroy.